Well, hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dave Chancellor, and I'll be your host. Our webinar today is on energy insecurity and how to better serve vulnerable communities. And I'm so happy to be able to introduce our three presenters. Diana Hernandez is an associate professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia University's Mellon School of Public Health. Destenie Nock is an assistant professor of engineering and public policy and civil and environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. And Gabriela Sandoval is director of race and equity policy at TURN, the Utility Reform Network. So thank you all so much for being here. I also want to acknowledge the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation of the Department of Health and Human Services for their partial support of this webinar series through their funding of IRP as the National Research Center on Poverty and Economic Mobility. That said, any positions expressed in today's webinar don't necessarily reflect any positions of ASPE or IRP. So we have an hour today, and after we hear from each of our presenters, we'll turn to your questions for Q&A. You'll see there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so you can type in questions throughout the webinar today. And you can also feel free to participate through chat. A lot of you are sort of engaged in the issues that we're talking about, so we love to hear about where you're working at and where you're working from. And so if you want to participate that way, please feel free. And we also have closed captions enabled, so you can also toggle those on and off at the bottom of your screen, depending on whether those are useful to you or not. So, and we are going to be posting slides and a recording of the webinar later on this week, so keep an eye out for that in your email. So Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Nock, and Dr. Sandoval, thank you again for being here. And Dr. Hernandez, as I mentioned, you're at the Columbia University Mellon School of Public Health, where you do work at the intersection of energy, equity, housing, and health. And I also want to note that when we were just beginning to plan this webinar, I called you and you said, Dave, you should really talk to Destenie Nock and Gabriela Sandoval. So as pleased as I am with our lineup of guests today, I cannot take any credit for it at all. So, so with gratitude, I want to turn it over to you now, and you're welcome to share your screen if you'd like to do so.
Thank you so much, Dave, for the invitation. And also, let me just set this up. And also for ensuring that I have friends on the panel. To me, I'm really grateful to share this time and the opportunity to share more about what energy insecurity is and really raising more awareness in the poverty research community, given that there's really a dearth of kind of attention to this issue. And I just want to acknowledge too that Gabriela Sandoval and I were graduate students about 20 years ago at Cornell, where we were studying poverty and inequality. And as it were, our lives and our work has kind of come together so many years later, and I'm really grateful for that. So why energy? Why is energy even important to include in any conversation, especially a conversation about poverty? And the truth is that we rely on energy every day. The lights are on, the air conditioning is running, the heat is going, our food is refrigerated and needs to be prepared. All of those kind of daily activities require energy. And in some ways, energy has always been in the background of our lives. And yet, you know, it's kind of moments of crisis. Sometimes that has to do with spikes in prices, which is in some ways what we're seeing these days. In other times, it's the realities of climate change that all of a sudden kind of put energy on the center stage. And for people that are unable to afford energy or easily access it, it's an everyday kind of personal crisis that puts it on the main stage. Suffice it to say that over the years, we've become more reliant on energy. The cost of energy has increased, consumption has increased, and the uses have varied over time. There was a point in history when heating and cooling were the main sources of energy use in the household. But that has changed as we have kind of incorporated more technology in our lives, and it has become more central to our daily activities. just kind of putting this in the current context, during this kind of 2021, we've seen, and as inflation has increased, and the price of energy has increased, we really have seen the cost of electricity be in line with an inflation overall. And it's expected to increase also during high demand season. So we saw that to be true during the heating season, this just past one, and we also are expecting that to be true over the summer months. But it's also been the case for quite some time that low-income households have paid a disproportionate share of their income toward energy. So this was a report that was released in 2016, and the data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2015. And essentially, you can see that in the lowest quartiles of income, there's relatively speaking, households are spending more of their limited income on the basics, including energy, such that for the lowest income household, they pay up to 20% of their income toward energy expenses. And yet, in many ways, the poverty literature has just not acknowledged this particular hardship. So for households, in the previous slide, you see that housing, food, healthcare, energy, clothing, these are understood to be some of the kind of basic household needs. And yet, household energy is non-discretionary. In some ways, there are some discretionary costs associated with some of those basics, but most would agree that these are really priority household expenses. The material hardships literature has essentially agreed, there's consensus around housing, around healthcare, and around food, but everything else is basically subsumed under these larger categories of bills. In some cases, utilities such as electricity, natural gas, water, telecom, internet services are all pooled. And so it's really difficult to see exactly what kind of hardship is associated specifically with energy. And yet, this has been the focus of my research over the past decade and a half. And this work really came about from connecting with people in their homes. It was my work around energy insecurity was in some ways an incidental finding. I was spending time doing home-based interviews in Boston when I realized there was a subset of issues that were absolutely happening for households, and yet there wasn't really a way to understand it. There wasn't really a body of literature that that talked about it, that named the issue, and that showed how it was connected to other facets of life, including health outcomes. So I've gone on to define the concept of energy insecurity as the inability to adequately meet basic household energy needs. I've identified this as a multidimensional issue so that it's not just about economic hardship. Although the kind of economic aspect of it is certainly an important quality of energy insecurity, which really reflects high bills relative to low incomes. In some ways, that is there's a concept called energy burden or fuel poverty, kind of does the same thing around looking at the economic components. Then there's the physical aspects, and that has everything to do with housing quality and the efficiencies of the building envelope, if it were, as it were, and also the specific appliances and the energy infrastructure. And then there's a behavioral component to energy, so that people are coping and they're managing their energy resources very closely. There are also two forms of energy insecurity. There's an acute aspect of it and a chronic one. So chronic really suggests that this is a constant issue for households, that it really is difficult for them to escape the challenges of the economic, physical, and behavioral dimensions. But there are also acute examples, and that is sometimes power outages are a reflection of that. Appliance breakdowns, fuel shortages, shutoffs, et cetera. And the reason why shutoffs are in there as an acute form of energy insecurity is that while it is absolutely kind of the crisis point of chronic energy insecurity, oftentimes the shutoffs or disconnections are short-lived. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Gabriela. But basically, this is a way to put together the different facets of energy insecurity so that energy burdens and buffers are the coping and the housing pieces are basically what I described as those core dimensions or components, but this also exists within the context of energy access, so that some people are completely disconnected from the grid. They have absolutely no connection to this. In the US, this is true in some indigenous communities. You also have the question of climate change and how climate change is basically presenting new challenges with respect to energy, and then the just transition. So we are moving in the direction of a clean energy economy, and with that shift comes some specific challenges for vulnerable populations, including and especially affordability. There are millions of households in the US that are energy insecure. And this has been kind of best captured by the Residential Energy Consumption Survey data. This is some figures that show their 2015 and their 2020 results. And you'll see that there was a slight dip in 2020. In some ways, that's a good thing. But we all know that 2020 was a very odd year. And if you look at some of the ways in which they're measuring energy insecurity, which is by foregoing or reducing basic necessities like food or medicine, as well as receiving a disconnection notice or keeping your home at an unhealthy temperature. What is really obvious is that the difference between 2015 and 2020 is actually having to do with the shutoff moratoria that were implemented in different states throughout the country, as well as the fact that people had more income supports. And so they were less impacted by the disconnections, but as you can see, there was kind of very little difference between the behavioral aspects of energy with the reducing or foregoing or keeping the home at an unhealthy temperature. What we also know is that households with children, renters, communities of color, and very low income households are all disproportionately impacted by energy insecurity. And that is a consistent finding across a number of different data sources. This is the REX data, but you also see it in ACS data, as well as with different surveys, including those that I have led. What we also know is that there are moments in time when energy insecurity makes headlines, and oftentimes that's connected to a death. And in this case, these were all deaths that happened in the year 2018, but they were very different. They happened in different seasons. So the Allen sisters died in a cold home. It's really unclear why their heating source wasn't working, but they were twins, so they were born together, but they also died together in their cold home in Brooklyn. This is also Peter Knoll from the Knoll Furniture family empire. He lived on the Upper East Side, where I'm located right now at the Russell Sage Foundation. There are $1 million homes. He lived in a multi-million-dollar townhome, and yet his home was also unheated as a result of an administrative challenge and a disconnection, kind of a lack of coordination between the Department of Buildings and the utility provider. And then Linda Daniels, who died in the summer of 2018, she relied on an oxygen concentrator and also had an arrearage, and she was still cut off. So in 2018, I did this study. I'm writing a book about this data, and it was in 10 different places around the country. And essentially what I found was that there are chronic conditions, acute triggers, coping, this black box of energy insecurity, and then adverse impacts related to health, the social, economic, and health impacts that are adverse for households. And I'd like to end my time by just sharing one of the stories, or possibly two, related to this project. And I'd like to introduce Patrick. So Patrick is a 31-year-old single man. He's a lifelong New Yorker. He was residing in the Bronx. He was living in his first apartment. And he had some experiences with energy insecurity that took the form of not having heat in his apartment, and also having received a disconnection notice because his employment status was fluctuating, so that his hours were not consistent, and he was also, he had been recently laid off. And so he said, since I lost my job, it's been like getting back and then catching up on the rent first. I still have to pay I still have to pay for food. I still have to get back and forth with transportation costs, and the utilities have become a last thing for me. And it shouldn't. It should be more like of a priority because I have to live somewhere. And he basically says that he's essentially juggling his bills. So that's his coping strategy. But also the landlord was supposed to pay for the rent. And in his case, he basically, talked about having to use an oven at night to stay warm. And that he felt completely uncomfortable in doing that. And he says absolutely that his sleep is disturbed. He says it definitely affects my sleep. I have to get up and put more clothing on and then turn the oven off and then come back and then turn it back on because it gets too cold. And basically he spends his night on and off, turning the oven on to get warmer and then losing sleep and trying to get back in. And putting it all together, he says, I just feel depressed. I'll be like, oh my God, here we go again. I'm gonna get this turn off notice. And I feel so depressed and anxious. How am I going to pay for it? Earlier this year in the Bronx, there was a fire that claimed the lives of 17 people in the Bronx. And in many ways, Patrick's story reminds me of the many ways in which households are coping, and they're coping at times risking their health and their lives. And ultimately, this is an issue that is a human rights issue and a justice issue, a social justice issue, an environmental justice issue. If we don't pay attention to it, many more lives will be lost. And so the work really is in naming the problem and ultimately getting to some solutions. And so I look forward to my co-panelists in sharing more of their insights on this work.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez. And Dr. Destenie Nock, again, let me invite you to start sharing your slides here. But you are an assistant professor of engineering and public policy and civil environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. And broadly, your research interests are built around using mathematical modeling tools to address problems related to sustainability planning, energy policy, equity, and engineering. And also I want to note that for the educators in our audience in particular, Dr. Nock has a YouTube channel where she has a handful of short explainer videos that I actually found really helpful, related to a lot of the concepts that we're talking about today. So Dr. Nock, thank you again for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk about how we created a method for unveiling hidden energy poverty using the energy equity gap. And if anyone wants to do a deep dive into anything I presented today, we just recently published this paper in Nature Communications. well, this year. So one thing that I would like to start with is this is really community informed research. And I'm going to start with my neighbor. So she is an older woman in her 80s with cancer. And one thing that I noticed during the summer is that her windows are always open during the pandemic. And she actually ended up fainting and had to go to the hospital. So her energy burden, the percent of income that she spends on covering her energy bills, is very low. She's not disconnected because she doesn't spend that much money on her bills, meaning she can always pay them, but her AC is broken and there's mold in her house. So when I looked up the definition of poverty broadly, it states that it's the state of one who lacks a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. And here, in terms of her form of energy poverty that she's experiencing, I would say that she's lacking a socially acceptable amount of energy because she's not able to safely keep herself cool enough in her house to avoid having to go to the hospital. And so in the energy poverty literature, energy burden dominates the analysis. And so Dr. Hernández, focused on energy insecurity. Here, I kind of look at it as being a facet of energy poverty. And so just to give you some context, in the 2021 Texas winter storm disaster, about 246 people died. And that event says it happens about every 10 years. But in Maricopa County in Arizona, between 2006 and 2016, 228 heat-related deaths occurred indoors, despite the presence of all of these households having an air conditioning unit. And so reasons behind that were that 30 households had electricity disconnected. 78 households actually turned off their working air conditioning unit to save money. And then, 120 households actually had a broken air conditioning unit. And so this is a big problem as we are moving forward with climate change and climate adaptation, because these households are experiencing what we would call like a hidden form of energy poverty because they have air conditioning units. Their energy burden's low, meaning that their energy bills are low enough to the point where they, in theory, can cover them, but it's because their behavioral coping strategies, in the case of the turned off their working AC, would actually make us believe that they're not energy poor, or so that would be hidden. And then the other households that have a broken AC unit, they're not receiving enough assistance to actually fix the air conditioning unit. So they continue to have a low energy burden, but then they would end up being missed if we use solely energy burden to look at who might need help. So we have this hidden inequity where on one end you're able to satisfy all of your energy demand, but at a very high cost, which would be a high energy burden. On the other side, you're unable to satisfy any of your demand because you've experienced an outage or you're disconnected. And in the middle, there are people who may be able to satisfy partial needs, but may be at risk of a heat-related illness or a heat-related death. And so that is something that's really important as we are thinking about solving this energy poverty challenge. And in the Q&A earlier, there was someone that also asked about the housing poverty challenge. And these things are very highly linked because if you're in a very old home, then you will experience other challenges with trying to cool and heat your home. And so one thing that we have been doing is working to incorporate this human behavior into our energy poverty analyses. So our study area was Arizona in the US. And in case you've never been there, it's very long, extremely hot summers, very mild winters, which is why we started with the air conditioning usage. And what we did was we used a regression analysis to identify when people would turn on their air conditioning units. So I promise not to have too much jargon in this talk, but on the x-axis, we have the daily mean outdoor temperature in Fahrenheit. On the y-axis, we have the daily electricity consumption in kilowatt hours. Each blue dot here represents 1 day of the year for this one household, and there are 6,000 households in our analysis. And then the star here, which is like right here in the middle, represents the first outdoor temperature when the household will be willing to use their air conditioning unit. And I should say that this data comes straight from the utility company, so it is smart meter data. And our hypothesis was that lower income households will have higher inflection temperatures because they wait longer to turn on their air conditioning units in order to save money on cooling. So this graphic here is a box plot of the different income groups where 1 is the lowest income group and 8 is the highest income group. The inflection temperature on the y-axis is that star that I showed you in the previous slide. So this would be the average outdoor temperature at which a household would start using their air conditioning unit. And the energy equity gap metric that we propose is the maximum of the median inflection temperatures subtracted from the minimum of the median inflection temperatures. And here we see that that occurs in the highest and the lowest income group, and the difference between them is about 6 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's just do a quick recap of the findings. So if we have a high income household in this green dotted line, where we have, again, our temperature on the x-axis and the electricity usage in the household on the y-axis, and we calculate the cooling inflection temperature, which is this red line here. Then if we take our low income household, which is the black group, and we look at the difference in the AC turn-on points, we actually see that across the 4 years of our study, the energy equity gap between low and high income households inflection temperatures is between 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning on average, low income groups wait 4 to 7 degrees longer in terms of the outdoor temperature just to start using their air conditioning unit, which we're saying is a hidden form of energy poverty and energy insecurity. And so over the 4 years, this gap is widening over time between the income groups, and that is correlated with increasing electricity costs. And there's also a lot of questions about how decarbonization will affect this, because we're going to have retirement of our high cost fossil fuel plants, but also we're going to need a lot more build out of transmission and renewables. And so those electricity costs will definitely impact this kind of hidden form of energy poverty. So how can we use this energy equity gap to inform policy? We have proposed a tier-based aid system where if you are 2 times the energy equity gap above the median, then you would be starting to be in this energy insecure zone, all the way up to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning that if you're waiting until the average temperature outdoors is 78 degrees Fahrenheit or more, then you are actually in our second tier, which is actually our energy poor tier. And we would assume that you might have a broken AC unit, or you may be experiencing a huge financial strain. So when we compared this to the energy burden measure, where we would say you are energy poor if you're spending more than 10% of your income covering your energy bills, and our second tier, where if you wait to turn on your AC until it's 78 degrees or more outside, only 3 out of 4,577 households were defined as energy poor under both measures, meaning that when we are looking at energy poverty and including energy poverty into the broader realm of poverty analysis, we need to make sure that we are capturing multiple metrics for this. And so earlier, Dr. Hernandez had presented multiple ways that energy insecurity can show up with like physical, behavioral, and economic. And so we need to make sure that we are including these multiple forms in our analyses. One thing I will just point out is that this energy limiting behavior has been complicated by the pandemic. And so on this graph, I'm showing you the changes in hourly electricity consumption on the X and different demographics on the Y. And the orange represents Arizona and the blue represents Illinois. So during the pandemic, overall, we saw a 4 to 6% increase in overall residential electricity consumption use. But one thing that we noticed is that there's a large difference between white and minority populations in Arizona, which uses a lot of electricity for cooling and heating. But in natural gas dominated Illinois, we see less of a difference between minority and between white and minority groups. And so this is something to investigate further as we are looking at the electric and natural gas heating systems. And these differences most likely stem from income changes, because we did see a lot of unemployment occurring during the pandemic. And when we actually took this information and we did a survey during the pandemic, asking people specifically if they were limiting their energy before or during the pandemic, we see that in our lower income groups, so all the ones at the bottom that are conveniently highlighted in this box, we see about 50% of low-income households report that they're actively limiting their energy consumption. And so these will be households that are most likely going to be missed and energy burden type measures. So that's very important for us to understand. So in conclusion, the energy equity gap can capture human behavior and people's tendency to reduce their consumption to save money who were previously missed under traditional income-based measures. Energy poverty is very important for solving housing-based poverty as well, and we need to include these in our poverty analyses. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nock. And let's turn to Dr. Gabriela Sandoval now. Dr. Sandoval, you are a Director of Race and Equity Policy at TURN, the Utility Reform Network, and you're a sociologist by training and were previously on faculty at UC Santa Cruz. In your current role, I know you work a lot with community organizations around California and do a lot to understand more about the where and why of utility shutoffs, where they're happening. And so we're so excited to hear about your work and kind of how it aligns with what we've heard from Dr. Hernández and Dr. Nock so far. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I want to first, of course, thank the Institute for Research on Poverty for hosting this important event, Dave for making preparation easy and enjoyable, my co-panelists for their groundbreaking work, and I'm especially grateful to Dr. Diana Hernández, who I first met, she already told you, about 20 years ago, and whose work serves as an inspiration for me. And then thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I like to begin presentations with stories to make sure that the emotional center of my audience's brains are primed for the wonkier information and numbers that I'm planning to share. And I'm also going to forewarn you that I am an emotional creature by nature, so please do not be alarmed when my voice breaks as I recount these stories. It seems no matter how often I tell them, they always make me want to cry. So I still think it's more important to share them than to avoid crying in front of hundreds of people. So here we go. All right. One day in early January of 2016, a little boy in Oakland, California, returned to school after winter break, and he was in the 3rd grade, and his teacher, a woman named Ms. Rivas, had sent home math workbooks printed on newsprint. She had sent these home with him and all of his classmates before the winter break so they could practice math at home over the holidays. When he returned to school, Ms. Rivas asked all her students to turn the workbooks in, and he didn't have his. Over the next few days, Ms. Rivas asked him repeatedly to please bring his workbook back to school. He hemmed and hawed, and after a few days, he told Ms. Rivas that his mom had burned the workbooks in order to keep him and his siblings warm over the holidays when their utilities were disconnected because she could not afford the bill. Oops. This is Ruben Carrillo. Mr. Carrillo was diagnosed with kidney failure, and he does all of his dialysis at home, as you can see here in the photo. His family's electricity bill skyrocketed to $2,000 a month, even though he's registered as a medical baseline customer and is on the discount program for low-income utility customers. Mr. Carrillo's utility company put his family on a $550 a month payment plan, but they still had to pay their current bill while paying these additional installments. Their utility company eventually shut them off because they could no longer keep up. Even after they told the utility company about Mr. Carrillo's medical condition, the company refused to restore their service. The family borrowed money from extended family and friends, and meanwhile, Mr. Carrillo had to leave his house to continue his life-saving dialysis at his daughter's home. His daughter couldn't afford a $2,000 a month bill either. So his children, all 4 of whom he adopted from the foster care system when he was a young man, because he couldn't bear to let them be separated, have been moving him from house to house to make the economic burden more manageable among them. I don't know how many of you know what dialysis is like, but moving Mr. Carrillo this often has likely shortened his life. I've got one more for you. This is KK Miller. Ms. Miller received the shutoff notice she had been dreading on a cold December day. After years of steady payments, she'd had a series of health crises and fallen behind on her utility bills. As a resident of subsidized housing, Ms. Miller knew that having her service shut off would put her in danger of being evicted as well, since utility service is often a condition of subsidized housing. She had 48 hours to pay $2,280. Ms. Miller suffers from serious health conditions, including a heart condition, diabetes, fibromyalgia. These all contribute to high energy costs and had led to thousands of dollars in utility debt during a period of housing instability. In 2007, she was able to move into highly coveted subsidized housing and worked out a monthly payment plan with her utility company to square her debt and keep her current on her balance. Over the years, she was able to pay off almost $5,000 in utility arrears. But when her health deteriorated, she fell behind on her bills again. Ms. Miller, facing both a shutoff and an eviction, was desperate when she called TURN. At TURN, we know that for many unhoused Californians, and this is likely true in other states, utility debt is often the final and insurmountable barrier to housing. We were able to ensure Ms. Miller paid off her bill and stayed in her home. The first story, the one about the 3rd grader, it was actually hearing this from one of my closest friends, Ms. Rivas, hearing her tell the story actually was what convinced me to join TURN in 2016 to lead a statewide campaign to reduce utility disconnections and to move the needle toward universal utility service in California. During the 6 intervening years, we've made some important advances. When I joined TURN, as you can see here, disconnections due to inability to pay were skyrocketing. And this is, of course, after the Great Recession, we're assuming people have recovered at this point. Now, think about the framing of this. I joined TURN to lead a statewide campaign to reduce utility disconnections. Why is the framing important? Because the way I and TURN thinks about energy security has evolved in significant ways, and it's ultimately that evolution that is most important for my presentation today. So my work went from reduce disconnections to address affordability, to energy insecurity during a global pandemic, to energy equity. I know it looks really nice and linear or circular here, but in reality, it's all interrelated, and we won't achieve energy justice without addressing all of it. So let's start with reducing disconnections. It was a 3.5-year-long campaign during which we actively reframed utility shutoffs as a public health concern. We mobilized a diverse coalition of grassroots organizations, public health departments, healthcare clinics, education rights, immigrant rights, housing rights, legal aid, and many other types of organizations. We hosted dozens of half-day-long shutoff trainings throughout the state. We sponsored legislation that, once signed into law, triggered the California Public Utilities Commission to open 2 related proceedings, one to reduce disconnections and the other to address affordability. And the second, which was to address affordability, was really among all utility services. So this included electricity, natural gas, water, and the telecommunications utilities, telephone, broadband for internet service, et cetera. So on June 11, 2020, the California Public Utilities Commission voted unanimously in favor of a blockbuster decision that included all of the following, well, everything that's on your screen, and then some. Due to time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time actually talking through what's on the screen. I'm pretty sure you can read through most of it, and we can talk about some of the policy fixes at the end. But when I first embarked on this work, it became very clear very quickly that disconnections were an incomplete proxy for understanding energy insecurity. So we began using a handful of data points beyond disconnections. And these showed us that at least 1 out of every 4 California households pre-COVID was already experiencing energy insecurity. And that doesn't take into account some of those hidden burdens that Dr. Nock mentioned earlier. We made important, if less dramatic, progress in the affordability proceeding. We won the use of 3 affordability metrics in every general rate case, the annual calculation and publication of these metrics for the 4 investor-owned utilities, and the calculation of these metrics anytime a proposed rate hike hits a particular cost threshold. The metrics include the affordability ratio, the socioeconomic vulnerability index, and hours at minimum wage. Now, before I move on to the impact of the COVID crisis, let me make one thing clear. The COVID pandemic did not cause a crisis in energy insecurity. The crisis was already present. I do not believe the crisis in energy insecurity and its role in exacerbating housing insecurity, homelessness, displacement, educational inequities, public safety, and public health concerns can be overstated. The crisis in energy insecurity was already staring us down before COVID-19, and it was and continues to be structural and systemic in nature and will require structural solutions. Now, I'm not going to rehearse the economic impact of COVID on our communities here. I'm assuming an audience of people concerned about poverty has a sense of this, but I will say that California utility customers went into the pandemic already owing over $500 million to their utility companies. And at the end of the moratorium, of the official moratorium, that debt had increased to $1.75 billion. And even after $600 million in energy debt forgiveness credits drawn from our budget surplus last year were credited to customers' accounts, the customers of the 4 big utility customers continued to owe $1.7 billion as of May 22. Now, TURN had a hand in getting that $600 million worth of credits, and we're working again this year to get at least another $1 billion credited to folks' accounts. Now, I don't want to leave you in a sad, dark place. This is absolutely a tale about the Herculean task of holding utility corporations accountable. We've had victories to celebrate and losses to recover from, but I want to leave you with some hope. So let's turn to equity, the most recent evolution of my thinking about energy justice, because here's the thing that is hopeful. We have a unique opportunity right now, today, to work together to achieve better outcomes for all the people, all the families who make up our communities. Our response must address the needs of the most vulnerable among us, the babies, our elders, the medically vulnerable, essential workers, people who lost their jobs through no fault of their own. If we cannot find our way to shared prosperity now, we might not ever. Oh my gosh, I still make myself really emotional here. Okay, so our response must include community voices. We must find a way to incorporate the voices and perspective of those most impacted by energy insecurity into our decision-making processes if we are truly committed to addressing the crisis of energy insecurity in California and across the country. Now, finally, our response must be equitable. Now, you might be thinking, Gabriela, why is equity in, why can't we just assume that utility provision is equitable? Of course it's equitable. It's completely colorblind, right? Well, it is absolutely inexcusable that the single most statistically significant predictor of shutoffs in California is Blackness. Black families are far more likely to be shut off than almost anyone else. And all else being equal, they're still more likely to be shut off. Black families are, Black households also have higher residential energy expenditures than white households in the US, even after controlling for income, household size, homeowner status, and city of residence. Now, as TURN's executive director, who I believe is on the line today, is fond of saying, the cost of greening the grid should not be cutting people off from the grid. When the cost of our push toward renewable energy is tacked onto utility rates, easily the most regressive and inequitable way to pay for climate justice efforts, or when utility companies subsidize the installation of residential car charging infrastructure with money collected through all ratepayer bills, but only people who can afford an electric vehicle benefit, or when you can't benefit from incentives to purchase rooftop solar because the home you own is so old and run down, your roof can't support the weight of panels, or because you rent, or because you live in the shade, but your utility company collects $30 to $50 from you every month through utility rates to subsidize other customers' rooftop solar. Or when you bear the disproportionate impact, environmental impact of energy policy while consuming and contributing the least to that same environmental degradation. In these and so many other ways, energy provision remains deeply and disgustingly inequitable. We must find a way to make far more equitable energy policy choices now. Okay, so I have some specific ideas about potential solutions, but I'm going to stop here for now and give the floor back to Dave.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Sandoval. And I do want to make sure that we have time to turn to Q&A here. And we've already got a number of questions in. And I think I want to combine a few that we've received. And I think one of the observations is that so many of the policies and just issues surrounding energy provision are hyper local, right? I mean, you're doing like local level utilities. There are variations in energy costs and just like housing infrastructure, all these sort of things that are local. And so when each of you think about solutions, how do you balance sort of the need for large scale sort of reform with those sort of this hyper local nature of these things? And Dr. Hernandez, would you be willing to start us off on that?
Just want to acknowledge the very powerful presentations that went before. I mean, I think you kind of started to allude to the fact that in some ways, the challenge here is that we don't have universal policies, disconnection policies. We also don't have universal rate structures across the states. There really isn't kind of a federal level appreciation, even though there are policies like the low-income home energy assistance program or the weatherization assistance program. These are actually block grants so that they're issued to states at various levels based on kind of a formula that privileges heating, for instance, even as people are experiencing many challenges with cooling, as was really highlighted in Dr. Nock's presentation. Ultimately, this is a lack of kind of coordination, a lot of this being regulated at the state level, where you have really progressive policies like in California. I think many of us are looking to California for examples of how to do things, but ultimately, this is really happening at the state level, and then at kind of smaller scales in different municipalities. But ultimately, it's a free-for-all in some ways, and you see it when you see the disproportionate kind of impacts of energy burdens regionally too. So that in the Southeast, for instance, you have some of the highest energy cost burdens, and that correlates to race. So that Black populations across the board, but also very specifically in some of these states, not only experience more disconnections, as was mentioned by Gabriela, but also by Dr. Sandoval, but also ultimately, in terms of what it costs to kind of operate your home in terms of energy, that is also kind of unequally distributed.
Dr. Nock, did you want, that was a broad question. I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to respond to that too.
Yeah, just to like build on what Dr. Hernandez has said, like I feel like one of the other challenges is that the US doesn't formally recognize energy poverty like as a federal problem. And so, as we are electrifying everything, if you're not going to like make sure that the tool that you are using to like get your heat and your cooking and your water and everything else in your home is like available to everyone, then we will have like a persistent problem. And so, it's all well and good to say, okay, well, we're going to electrify everything because that's like great for climate change. But then if we're like, well, we're not going to actually make sure that people have like a certain standard of access to that electrification, well, then you're just like exacerbating the problem. And so I definitely agree that there is this need to like kind of work both at like the federal level and at the local level, but there are some things happening like consistently in so many local areas that like we really do need like a federal policy to address this.
Okay. Dr. Sandoval?
Yeah, I'll just add one little thing briefly. I think I agree with my co-panelists, and I'll just say, when I first started this work looking at disconnections, I tried to gather disconnections data, very basic, one metric from all 50 states in Washington, D.C. I was able to gather about 31 data points. They were all over the place. I couldn't compare the data because they, measured different types of disconnections. Different states had different lag times in terms of publishing these data. So I had, everywhere from 2012 to 2016 data. Some states only gather these numbers during certain parts of the year. And, to make matters worse, of course, there's a whole host of states who don't gather this data at all or don't make it public. I will say as well that one particular state that will go unnamed handwrites their reports, their shutoffs reports. They have a small paper with a spreadsheet, and for each month, like they literally sent me a PDF of 12 of these sheets with 1 month's data on handwritten in pencil on each sheet. So I think apart from the other ways that we need to standardize our measurement and addressing these issues, like we need to start with this basic piece of, we can't fix the problem if we don't know the magnitude of the problem. And the fact is we don't really know. Even the information I shared with you, it's for the investor-owned utilities because they're regulated. But there's a host of municipal utilities in California. They're a black box. I have no idea what's happening with them.
We have a lot of questions that are kind of looking at the link between housing policy and energy policy, because obviously these are so connected, just like the state of the housing stock can make a big difference in terms of pricing. And I know any of you could address these questions, but I just kind of want to make sure we go through them. And Dr. Nock, could you give us some insights onto that and just sort of how you think about these connections there?
So, I mean, you can't solve the energy crisis without solving the housing crisis. I mean, Gabriela talked before about, if we want to like be able to stop disconnections, or, if children want to be able to study in their homes, then they need to be able to be safe in those homes. And then when we're thinking kind of like as Diana had pointed out about all the different types of people that will need help and the different ways that they cope without that, without a secure energy, then they will end up doing unsafe things in their home. Now, the quality of your house is going to affect the level of unsafeness. So if you are in a house without any insulation, if you're in one of the trailer homes that doesn't really, it's like a big tin can, I can speak from that experience because my family does stay in a trailer sometimes. It gets sometimes much hotter inside than it is outside, and that's going to be a big problem. And so I think that one of the biggest challenges is to figure out how we can work at the intersection of multiple forms of like poverty alleviation efforts. And so there are ways to kind of lower the like procedural burden on families, like such as like if you qualify for food stamps, then you should automatically qualify for other forms of assistance. And then, you know, potentially also like with like how we saw with like the medical challenges in Gabriela's presentation, as well as like with my neighbor, if you are, you know, experiencing medical challenges, then you need to automatically like be on a no disconnection list. And that should be something that is mandated by the government due to health and safety concerns. And so I think that that is something that it's like, it's going to be a challenge to get people to work together, right? And get different agencies to work together. But I do think that housing poverty and energy poverty is so interconnected that like, it's vital that they work together.
Okay. You know, from what you were saying at the end there, Dr. Nock, I want to go to Dr. Hernandez and just kind of like look at some of these connections between energy policy and health a little bit more. I know this is sort of the bread and butter of a lot of your work. And in terms of when we think about policy, especially policy solutions, how do you think that policymakers and people who are working on this should really be thinking about those issues?
So I came into public health in the late 2000s when there was a push around health in all policies. And the idea was that, you know, if it's housing policy, if it's urban planning, anything that is, you know, anything basically will need to address health. And in some ways, we're in a different moment now, which is that, you know, we're thinking about climate and we're also thinking about a clean energy economy. And in many ways, we're thinking about energy in all and climate mitigation and kind of preparedness, et cetera, in all policies. What I know to be true is that there's no such thing as health as a human right or housing as a human right, but for the fact that you have affordable, accessible, and available energy. So I think ultimately what we're talking about are kind of interesting solutions for in reimagining who pays for energy, how wealth is distributed, how clean energy is distributed. To Gabriela's point, it's true. If you don't have a functional roof, you can't actually support solar panels, rooftop solar panels. But if you're a renter, you also can't participate in that. And so I think that nowadays there are, through community solar, for instance, interesting opportunities to reimagine what it looks like to participate in the clean energy economy. But I think also there's a growing appreciation for medical vulnerabilities and what it means to be in a state like California that does preemptive shutoffs, right? These public safety shutdowns, which basically mean that it doesn't matter if you're a rich person in California or a poor person in California, you are insecure. And so I think all of a sudden, we are appreciating a few things. One, we're appreciating that the housing infrastructure in the US is aging, and that as people age, they need energy very differently. And ultimately that we can't just go to clean energy without also factoring in the costs, so that if people are making compromises between and trade-offs between what they can afford and what they perceive to not be able to afford, that itself is burdensome psychologically and physically on populations.
Okay. I want to fit kind of one more question in here before we kind of go to maybe some of your closing thoughts. But Dr. Sandoval, you know, your presentation so beautifully kind of emphasized like just the role of these individuals here. And I want to ask about sort of how you think about bringing in all the various stakeholders that you do in your work. You know, we've got a couple of questions that have come from people doing child welfare work, like how do they think about energy in that? And how do so many of these people, low-income folks that are so dramatically affected by what we're hearing about here, how do their voices get brought into these things and they be part of the decision-making process?
That's a great question. So in California, we have, we're very fortunate to have what we call intervener compensation, which allows nonprofit organizations to participate very actively. We actually are compensated for our participation in proceedings at the California Public Utilities Commission. And so TURN doesn't take our responsibility as a representative of ratepayers lightly. We work really hard with, we have, well, first of all, we have a community organizing department in our organization. I believe our organizing director, Constance Leiter-Pierre, might be on the line. So she actually has boots on the ground, people going out and talking to folks about energy crises, all the different ways that energy burden shows up and energy insecurity shows up in different, widely varying California communities, be they rural or urban. So that's a really important part of it. But we also work with organizations that are representative of folks throughout the state of California to, we provide technical assistance to help them participate more actively at the state legislature, at the federal level, and especially at the California Public Utilities Commission, because I think that regulatory piece is often overlooked as a very important lever for influencing, for impacting energy insecurity. So that's one of the ways we do this. And we're big supporters of other states having intervener compensation programs, which more and more states are adopting a structure like this. And so we do think that that's a key aspect of California, that allows us to bring community voices to bear at the CPUC.
I know we're just over the hour, but I want to give each of our presenters just kind of an opportunity to leave us with sort of a parting thought. Dr. Nock, would you just start us off first? What do you want to leave us with? What are you looking forward to? What do you think are some of the key factors kind of going forward here?
So I think one thing I'll leave us with is that there are multiple forms of energy poverty that will intersect with other types of poverty in multiple ways. So we talked a lot about housing poverty. I mean, there's also the medical based poverty, whether that energy is the barrier or the medical bills are kind of leading to energy poverty. And so I think that we need to really work at finding solutions to solve these problems at the intersection of the multiple forms of poverty and insecurity.
Okay. Dr. Sandoval?
Well, I'm going to riff off something I heard at an event that Dr. Hernández organized just before the pandemic set upon us. And that is that it is energy policy that got us into this climate mess that we're in, and it's only energy policy that's going to get us out. So that, along with, what we do for the least among us, we do for all of us. I think those are two key takeaways for today.
Okay. Dr. Hernández, you started us off. Will you finish us up today?
Yeah, I'll just say that recognition is the first step to justice. And as more people recognize this problem and are in positions to contribute with integrity to this work, we ultimately get to a place where we can come up with solutions. We are all we're interdisciplinary in our foci, and I think ultimately it would be great for more people, especially in the poverty literature, to take this up.
Okay. I am so grateful to the three of you and to everyone that joined us today for this. I know we went a little bit over time, but I think it was very worth it. And so again, if you just joined us, we are going to be sending out a recording and slides later on this week. And I know folks have asked about contact information for our presenters, so I'll link you to their websites there. So again, thank you so much to all of you. Dr. Hernández, Dr. Nock, Dr. Sandoval, thank you for being here, and so long.